Welcome back, folks, to part 2 of this special episode of Psycho Schizo Espresso, in which we're talking to Mike Anderson, Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Murdoch University in Western Australia, about intelligence, specifically what intelligence actually is, why intelligence is such a hot topic, and whether meaningful differences, racial differences, cultural differences, gender differences, really do exist in intelligence across various societies, groups and cultures. So I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that actually, okay, so lots of people have been kind of reevaluating their lives in terms of like, should they do something else because of the pandemic? So yeah, you've got this kind of flexibility of thinking, which could arguably be described as intelligence, flexible thinking. But also, I've been thinking about this, and other human qualities during the pandemic have also come to the fore, like things like loyalty, things like resilience, things like basic kindness. Have we actually been overvaluing intelligence, do you think? And is this one of the things the pandemic might have shown us, that actually there are other human values and attributes and qualities out there which are just as important?
Well, I think absolutely on the button, Kevin. Definitely so. As I say, I think it depends on what state your society is in. Because as I would claim, the freeing up of the whole intellectual capacity of a society led to bounties that, unknown in human history, and we've all benefited from that. But it's maybe getting a little bit over the top, and it's time for a little bit of a reappraisal where you're saying, look, if somebody's prepared to work in an aged care home and has the capacities to be compassionate and empathic with other people, that makes their end of life better. For Christ's sake, why are we paying them hardly anything? This is ridiculous.
What you're talking about there's the elephant in the room is not human intelligence, it's artificial intelligence, which is going to force us, I think, to reappraise not just the functionality, but the purpose of the existence of human beings. That's going to be forced upon us, and we're going to have to deal with the consequences of having people who were educated to do jobs, and there are not really jobs there for them anymore. So what do they do with their lives to justify their existence? We're not programmed as a society to deal with that conundrum. And it's not, it should be, as if you've got people who are, you say, well, okay, so basically the world just turns itself into a giant coffee shop with people, entertainers and comedians and people having fun and having dinner, because let's face it, all the other processes can be automated by and large. Not all of them, but a lot of them can. But we're not thinking like that. We're still thinking in the old ways. And you have overlap now with third world countries, where what third world countries need is they need the educational revolution that we had 30 years ago. They need knowledge transfer. So we level up. I hate using level up because it's got that dreadful bloody political connotation, but to level up the world. And people think it's about transfer of technology. It's not about transfer of technology. It's about transfer of permission of critical thinking.
Mike, can I before you jump in there? Can I just get in there, because I want to open that up a bit, because I think that's just a brilliant insight. And Bruce was talking about automating. The world's becoming automated. So Bruce was talking about artificial intelligence. I want to broaden this particular aspect of the discussion out. I'm going to go the other way, and I'm going to look at, I'm going to throw animal intelligence into the mix here, and I want to look at evolution, right? So we tend, you're going back to, the liberal democracy and how we might have been overvaluing intelligence. Of course, if you look at, evolution, intelligence evolution has coded intelligence for human beings. And this thing that we call intelligence, obviously in our context, in our world, is really, really important. But actually, I think one of our guests, Steven Pinker, he came up with the great analogy, and it was, the average IQ of a human being is something like 105. The average IQ of a trout is 4. So why can't human beings catch trouts easily? Okay, with that. So it's a kind of a little amusing observation, but actually, speaks to a very, very profound point, and that is that for a lot of the animal kingdom, intelligence, as we would regard intelligence, problem solving, reasoning, that kind of thing, is not important. It's not important for a leopard. A leopard needs to be fast. A lion needs to be strong. Maybe that's what intelligence means for a lion or a leopard. And that's automated. That's automated as well.
Yeah, but it's interesting as well whether or to what extent learned intelligence can be passed on, because, of course, you've got to figure out that there are mechanisms in animals whereby, why do cats always shit in a box? How do they know?
That's the title. That's the title of this podcast, right there, folks. Bruce,
why do they know? How do they know? How do they know?
Why do cats shit in a box is the title of this podcast.
Yeah.
Well, right, there you go. I hear what Steve Pinker's saying, right? But I would rather be the fisherman and the trout any day. And by the way, were I so inclined, I could go and shoot a deer or something. I don't have to catch a trout, but the trout can do nothing much but swim about.
But you know what he means, Mike, don't you? You kind of intelligence is important to us, but maybe evolution doesn't always move towards intelligence as we see it, as the pinnacle.
What Steve Pinker might have been poking a stick at is that the intelligence that we've been talking about today, and in terms of a competence, that is that you have a brain that's set up to think, right? Undoubtedly, the ability to think per se is one of the things, not the only thing, but one of the things that sets us apart from other animals, right? It's given us a phenomenal power.
Sure. Yeah.
But certainly in terms of whether that depends on structures in the brain, which it almost certainly does, there's 2 comments on this. That hasn't changed for 200,000 years, right? The human brain has been pretty much as the human brain is for 200,000 years. Now, our situation is so different from what our situation would have been 200,000 years ago. Yeah. It's not even funny,
Yeah.
So, in one sense, the intelligence that we've been talking about today, the things that make one person more intelligent than another, Steve Pinker's right. Evolution hasn't cared about that. Hasn't mattered, right? It doesn't count. It hasn't counted for anything in evolutionary terms. And one of the reasons we know that is there's still genetic differences in our ability to think, right? And if it had been so bloody important, evolution would have, weeded that out. There is no genetic variation in things like being able to walk or being able to run, and all that stuff's been sorted out. And the variation, if you like, is trivial. And so the variation that's left in our ability to think in evolutionary terms is trivial.
Yeah.
But we don't live 200,000 years ago. We live in a modern society.
Yeah.
And what we were talking about 10 minutes ago is in the society that we've lived in, where we shifted from catching animals and digging up plants to other ways of generating wealth and prosperity. The key attribute there was this quirky little thing in our heads called intelligence. But it's time maybe to rethink how we organise things, because we can't keep going that way, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I wrote that in Black and White Thinking, Mike, and which obviously you're in the book, but I made that point that the world we lived in 200,000 years ago was very different to the world we lived in today. We lived in a far simpler world back then, but we have to.
Kevin, can I interrupt?
Yeah.
Kevin, can I interrupt just a wee minute? Because I think it was a point you made, or maybe it's a point that Bruce made. Here's the other thing, right? When Einstein came up with relativity, the greatest physicists in the world at the time, well, not so much as I understand it, I'm no physicist, but as I understand it, not so much special relativity, but general relativity. Most of them couldn't understand it, right? What are you talking about? Now, your Commonweal Garden first-year physics students gets it, right? Now that, Bruce, is the cultural transmission of knowledge, right? Those kids who go into first-year physics at university and are taught general relativity are thinking the thoughts that Einstein had 100 years ago, but it's been presented to them and scaffolded for them in such a way they don't have to be Einstein to think them, but you had to be Einstein to think it in the first place, right? So the cultural transmission of knowledge in human society is incredibly important. It is massively important.
Is that the equivalent, Mike, of building a McDonald's on the top of Mount Everest? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
But I mean, what I was going to say was actually you've beaten me to it really. That 200,000 years ago, the world was a very different place to the world that we live in now. But we have to use the same brain that we had 200,000 years ago to navigate the world that we have today. Yeah. And of course, what we have today is lots of moral, ethical dilemmas. Everything is far more on a continuum than it was back then. And I think that's, Bruce and I have chatted about this before. That's kind of the source of a lot of the problems that we have today. And as I say, I wrote it in Black and White Thinking. We have this binary black and white brain of 200,000 years ago, with which we have to use that to dissect and analyze a lot of the grayscale continua that we deal with today. And there's this mismatch between the binary brain that we had years ago and inherited from our ancestors and the grayscale nature of reality that we have today.
The problem is what we're going to do about it, Kevin, because there's no fast track to evolving the human brain. And we also don't live long enough to learn the lessons, to be smart enough to pass it on, emotionally speaking, to the previous generation. I mean, one of the things I would say is that if you look at the number of people there are in the world at the moment, how many people do we need in the world, right? This is not like some espousing that we should murder everybody or anything else like that. But just think back to when the world was much, much smaller, 500-600 years ago, and there weren't so many people in the world, and most people died by the time they were 50 or 60. So you had a very small window of opportunity to accomplish Shakespeare, all of it. It all happened in a compressed. What do we do in our lives that has really significantly altered the reality around us? Probably you could point to a span of 5 or 10 years in people's lives, tops. And for the rest of their life, they're coasting on the basis of that. It's like, the rock star that had one hit and it's done him for the whole rest of his life. He's never had to write another song. He's written hundreds of them, but nobody knows what they are. There's just the one song and it's done it for him, right? And that's him. That's his career done. He just keep doing that till he's 70, which is lovely. And it's great that we're all living so long and being healthy and everything else like that. But are we actually changing the fabric of our environment? No, we're all coasting. And that's a reality. And it's probably an uncomfortable one for people to think about, that they're by and large, pretty much useless by the time of 40, 50 years old. But we have... I think we need to slowly make human beings. I'm not saying you need to get rid of them because we're worthless. I actually think we need to have less human beings that are more valuable.
Mark Twain. There's a great quote from Mark Twain. Bruce. I think it was Mark Twain who said, "It's not the fact that there's too many idiots in the world. It's the problem is that the lightning ain't distributed right." I think was a Mark Twain quote. But
I mean, populations in our liberal democracies are diminishing. They're going down.
Yeah.
Why is that? Because children are very expensive, and people sort of go, I really want to look after my kids. I can only afford one or two to bring them to this level. Now, if you level up the world, my opinion, I mean, this is only an opinion, what will happen is that the children in other jurisdictions will become very expensive. And so gradually the level of world population will go down, but the value of its population will increase.
I think that's probably true. I mean, we're stepping outside my comfort zone, I must say here, chaps. But as I understand it, really large family sizes historically have been driven by child death.
Yes.
Two things: child death and no welfare for old people.
Yeah.
So you had to have big families to give yourself a chance of having kids who might look after you when you could no longer look after yourself.
Yeah.
So when poverty goes down, you tend to find family sizes go down.
Yeah.
Which is why a lot of the Malthusian predictions about the world was going to end because we're overpopulated didn't pan out. You look at Europe now, and countries like Italy have really low replacement rates.
Yeah.
The corollary of that is there does seem to be a bit of a malaise for people in, well, what are we here for then?
Yeah.
What's it all about? What's giving us meaning? When we could be starving the next day, we don't sit about thinking about that much. We just think about, shit, I better get up in the morning, sharpen my spear and go and collect a deer. Otherwise, we'll all starve. Now, there was a psychological comfort in that you didn't really have to think, what am I going to do today and what's the point of it? The point of it is that you don't die. But now we're in a society where, in the West at least, and in the worlds we live in, historically speaking, it's so comfortable, it's not funny. You know what I mean? And then people are sticking their heads up and going, well, what's it all about then? And that's the thing. Bruce, you were talking about educating other generations. I think that's the pivotal role that things like schools and universities and art, to be honest, and art. See, what science has been brilliant at, in my opinion, is finding out the way the world is. And once we started finding out the way the world is, we found we could change it to our benefit. And we've done this remorselessly. But to answer the question, well, but why are we doing this and what do we want to do it for? At the beginning was easy, it's so we don't starve. But now it's not so clear, what we're going to do with all this accumulated wealth.
So we're hoping you are enjoying our little chat on Schizo Espresso. But don't forget, we do have a special thing for you. If you want to pay £4 a month, you can become a Patreon, which means you get the unedited content, you get the extra long episodes, and we're even going to come up with some special stuff for you. You can become a Patreon if you want at patreon.com/psycho-schizo espresso. And now back to the music.
Kevin, you and I have talked about this. I'm a huge fan of David Hume.
Yeah.
And David Hume introduced the very famous distinction in philosophy between is and ought.
Absolutely.
And what science has been brilliant at, in my opinion, unsurpassed, has been saying the way it is. This is the way the world is. This is our understanding of it. But unfortunately, that doesn't tell us the way it, quotes, should be, or the way we might want it to be.
Yeah.
And there isn't been enough discussion in modern societies, particularly since the end of the Cold War, because I think what the Cold War did for us was give us an example of who we didn't want to be. So that was motive enough. But then when in 1989, famously, it looked like democracy had succeeded, everybody got bored shitless and thought, well, what next then? And I think that's a wrong way of thinking. We should be thinking about what are we going to do with this bounty that is uplifting and beneficial and makes people want to get out of bed in the morning. And that's where I do think the arts and the humanities, if we're talking about intellectual disciplines, have much more to say than science itself has to say.
Well, but psychology, I think, the way that what motivates human beings. I mean, I think probably there's got to be some element in education which enables people to be able to think like we thought 100,000 years ago, but keep it in context. So to say, actually, you are a. I used to have I had a sketch once that I was going to do. Once there was a TV thing, and I had a sketch called the Supermarket Primitive. And this bloke was dressed in a loincloth, and you'd go around with a spear, and he'd just be running around the supermarket stabbing the beef and taking it to the checkout. And but it's the irony that actually we are the supermarket primitive. I mean, we underneath it all, that's kind of who we are. But we can't be that person. So instead, we become football hooligans or do this or whatever gets us into our comfort zone and fantasy zone of being primitive, hunter-gatherer, blah, blah, blah. I'm a male, or whatever pronoun you want to go up with, but it doesn't matter. The point is that that's part of our DNA, and it's being partially denied, but there's nothing else been put in its place.
Do you know what, Bruce? Mike, I just want to jump in here because I think this is a good point to bring in something which I've been thinking about for a while, and that is like whether intelligence, as we kind of define it, is culturally is related to culture and is culturally mediated. Now, I'll give you a great example of this. There's a tribe in West Africa called the Baole tribe, and intelligence to the Baole tribe is not what we would regard as normal problem solving. It's the ability to facilitate and maintain cohesive group relations within the tribe. That, to the Baole tribe of West Africa, is what they mean by intelligence. And there's been studies done with tribes in rural Kenya, where adults of the tribe have been asked to judge how intelligent the kids of the tribe are. And this is really interesting. Intelligence in certain tribes in rural Africa, very remote rural Kenya, is ascertained not by what we would regard as normal problem-solving ability, but it's defined by the ability to source and mix herbs in the environment to self-medicate against illness and disease within that particular context in which they live. And here's the interesting point, the afterword on that. The kids that were judged by the tribal elders, the adults in rural Kenya, who were judged more intelligent by nature of the fact that they could source and mix the right herbs to self-medicate, actually performed worse on standard tests of intelligence than actually the kids that weren't judged by their tribal elders to be more intelligent. So this is something which, and Bruce has been kind of, we've on the board of this for a while now in this podcast. The idea to which, well, there's two questions really. There's one big elephant in the room: the ability, the degree to which intelligence is genetic, and also the degree to which it's actually, as Bruce has been alluding to, whether it's actually culturally determined as well.
Right. Okay.
Two big ones there. Yeah.
No. Let me again commenting on what other cultures would consider intelligence to be would require a lot of unpacking. You mean at one level it's not surprising, right?
Of course,
it would be not surprising it's something. But is that what we call intelligence? Well, if these people were the same people, that is, they had fast processors like the way we were talking about, then we would be meaning the same thing. But if it's just simply using the word to refer to a different kind of activity, I'm not saying it's trivial, but it's not important scientifically. But on the question, the really critical question, that's been one of the snags about this modern conception of intelligence and this modern manifestation of it. Is it genetic or is it cultural? Well, I hope for you guys, what I've said already makes it really clear that I think in terms of our cognitive capacity, there is a huge cultural component. As I said, it doesn't take Einstein anymore to understand relativity. We know stuff. We know stuff that really, really, Aristotle would come across as an ignoramus in some aspects of things like. And he was obviously, in some senses, super smart. So the cultural overload to intellectual capacity is enormous, right? But, and it's a big but, in the Western democracies that we've been talking about, where there is, and these are important caveats, where there's universal access to a decent educational system from a fairly early age, it turns out that there's a substantial genetic component to variations in intelligence. And there's just kind of no getting away from that. And there's something, we have to take that on board and think, well, what are the implications of that? Because some people draw conclusions that are, in my opinion, unwarranted from that, what I consider to be a basic fact. Or because they draw conclusions that they think are heinous, that some people are going to be condemned to a life of penury because they don't have the right genes. They don't realise this is-ought distinction that Hume had. The facts of the matter do not determine how the way the world should be. We have choices about what we do with facts of the matter. But so the other thing to be really, here's something to think about, what genetic actually means, and people can be confused about it. So, for example, the fact that you have two eyes is genetic, right? But it doesn't contribute to heritability because everybody has two eyes. You have two eyes because it's genetically programmed, but there's no variation in that across the human species. Yeah. So it comes back to this evolutionary thing again. Genes build brains that do stuff. Some of the stuff it does doesn't vary between people, but it happens to be that somehow the genes that contribute to intellectual differences as we measure them, there's still significant variation in that, still significantly prevalent.
But the same would go with your analogy of eyesight as well. So everybody has born with two eyes, but different people inherit different characteristics for their eyes,
of the eyes,
and their ability to focus. When their eyes start going wobbly in old age, or it's like my dad had glasses, blah blah blah. And therefore, so the vision, eyesight, just the same way as the brain. You have two eyes, but your eyes are not the same as another person's eyes.
Absolutely. But sometimes those variations that you see, let's take hearing, So some people have, when they're 40, 50, have very poor hearing because they worked in a mechanics factory all through their 20s and their 30s. Or they played in rock bands who had amplifiers who were way too loud. So, there could be genetic differences causing differences, but there could also be big environmental effects as well. Yeah. And it's really just trying to understand what the relationship between these two things, that's where the action is. Anybody who says there's no genetic influence is crazy. Anybody who says it's only genetics is crazy. It's the question of how do they work together.
Yeah. I mean, why are people so frightened of the genetic argument? Mike, do you think why does it generate so much heat? This,
I think it's because it leads to notions of biological essentialism, and that's your lot in the world. If we take the most controversial that there has been over the past 50 years, it's been the consistent finding that Afro-Americans score, one standard deviation lower on standardized IQ tests than white Americans, right?
Yeah.
And that has, on the one hand, on, if you want to put it this way, the right of politics, it's allowed people to say, look, don't give me all this racism and poverty shit. It's people who are not as smart don't do as well. Final analysis, nothing more to be said. So people who think, hang on a minute here, there's palpable instances of racial injustice. You're talking through a hole in your head here. There is no difference in intelligence. It's just that these people are phenomenally disadvantaged. And then somebody else will say, yeah, but so-and-so showed there are big genetic components to variation in intelligence. Why should that be any different? Why shouldn't it be the case that the reason that you lot aren't doing so well is because you've not got enough of the good genes? So it's hugely explosive and has, in my view, erroneous political consequences, quite apart from the fact of the matter.
Yeah. I mean, doesn't it bring us back to, how we test for intelligence? I mean, it's something we've been talking about intelligence for the last hour and a half, and we actually haven't talked about how we even measure it. I mean, we've got these things called IQ tests, which are all over the internet. Yeah. We know about Mensa and all these kinds of high IQ societies. Yeah. I mean, whether you're intelligent or not, to what extent does it depend on, what we're using to measure it?
Well, it shouldn't, right? I mean, it's like saying the length of something depends on which ruler you use. I mean, what kind of state of affairs is that? That's why that's why a scientific conception of intelligence should stand back from the things that we use to measure it. So I wear two hats here. So IQ tests are by far and away the most useful contribution, in my opinion, that psychology's made to society for 100 years. But they're not scientific instruments, right? And in fact, part of the reason that they're good is that they're not scientific instruments. So, Kevin, I'll give you an analogy here. IQ tests are like a way of appraising whether your car's going to go fast or not. And you might drive it along a straight road or take it round a bend or see what it does uphill, and you have this overall measure of how fast your car goes. But that doesn't tell you how your car works, right? So it doesn't tell you about whether there's carburetors or fuel injections or numbers of cylinders or whatever. What the science bit does is say, look, all these things are important for ultimately how far your car goes, and we should be trying to measure these things for specific reasons and to advance science. But nobody's going to come up with a better measure than how fast does your car go. So IQ tests work, but the reason they work is still unknown. Somebody like me thinks they know why, but other people would contest this and say, the only reason your car goes fast is because you can afford lots of petrol at the petrol station and I can't afford any, or you can, get better tyres, or all sorts of other variables. And where the genetics of intelligence has got really distorted is to try and say that whole classes of people are genetically inferior to other classes of people, because surely it must be the case. I'll give you an example of why it doesn't have to be the case. And I used to do this with the students, because the students used to get really confused over this point. So I'd be saying to them, there's a high heritability to IQ, right? And there is. A caveat being, in Western democracies where kids, by and large, have access to universal education and so on.
Do we have any numbers, Mike? Do we have any numbers on that?
Yeah, look, the most gung-ho would say somewhere between 70 and 80% of the variation in IQ is genetic.
Wow.
Probably more conservatively, you'd be talking about half of the variation is due to genetic differences. So if you get a standard deviation difference, as you did when it was reported in the 80s and the 90s, between one race and another race, standard deviation, that is a big chunk of a difference. Yeah. And particularly the extremes, it makes a big difference. Then people go, well, surely it must be genetic then, if there's such a genetic. Well, I'll give you an example, and we published this about 15 years ago, actually, Corinne and I, my wife. And we did this thing where I simulated a population, and we called it the regime of the hammer, right? And the idea was that there was this dictator, and he wanted people to clean the toilets, frankly. And he found that most of his population were getting a bit iffy about this. I don't really. And he was finding it hard to recruit people to clean the toilets. So he asked his consigliere, how do we solve this problem? He said, I've got a brilliant idea. when babies are born, every so often we'll hit one of them over the head with a hammer, right? And that'll lower their IQ by about 15 points. If we lower their IQ by about 15 points, we'll have enough of them at the bottom end who'll say, oh yeah, I'm quite happy to clean the toilets because there's nothing else anybody will give me to do, right? So it's called the regime of the hammer. Now, the dictator, being a dictator, he was uncomfortable with doing this at random. He wanted to pick on somebody. So he says, oh, great idea, but let's do it to every baby that's got red hair. Let's use red hair as the marker. A kid's born with red hair, bong, hit them with a hammer. And that'll lower their IQ, right? Brilliant idea. Only about 10% of the population will have red hair. So I simulated this idea of the regime of the hammer, and I started off with a really high estimate of 80% heritability. 80% of the differences in intelligence are genetic. What happens if you hit all the red-headed kids over the head with a hammer? Well, if you look at their mean IQs, as predicted by the consigliere, their IQ drops by a standard deviation of 15 points. So there's 15-point difference between people with red hair and people who don't have red hair. What happens to the heritability? Yes, it goes down. It goes down from about 80% to 75%.
Yeah.
Right? So you still have a huge heritability in the population.
Yeah.
So you then ask yourself the question, why have people with red hair got lower IQs? Well, we know the answer, right? They were hit over the head with a hammer. But if you didn't know they were hit over the head with a hammer, you might went, well, maybe it's something to do with their genes, because red hair's genetic, right? And it is. It's genetic. But the effect was an environmental effect. They got hit over the head with a hammer, but it was their genes that attracted the hitting over the head with a hammer. Now, you translate that into black and white, and you have people with palpably different skin colours who may end up having environmental insults that are the equivalent of being hit over the head with a hammer. And you could make the false attribution that their lower measured intelligence was something to do with their genes, and you'd be wrong, right? And so the case has never been, to my satisfaction, been demonstrated that there's anything to do with the genes of intelligence that vary between the races. And I call it an argument by innuendo. It's not a scientific argument.
Bruce, that's got to be the title of an album, hasn't it? The Regime of the Hammer.
The Regime of the Hammer.
I mean, that's got to be an album of some sort there, right there.
It's Lewis Hamilton, isn't it? That's what he always says. No, that's what he always says when it's when he puts his foot down. When team boss on the radio says it's hammer time, Lewis. Yeah, that's what he's called. It's hammer time. Put the hammer down.
Mike, I can't let you go. I know we've been going for a long time now. I can't let you go without talking about Savant syndrome. Savant syndrome. Absolutely, we're totally and utterly fascinated by Savant syndrome. I mean, even if you look at films, well, even something like Sherlock Holmes. Benedict Cumberbatch's portrayal of Sherlock Holmes as like as a genius detective, but high on the Aspergic spectrum. Recently, I think 2019, we had Cody Lee, a blind pianist songwriter. Who blitzed America's Got Talent. We are fascinated by savants. And I've been thinking about this, why we're so fascinated by savants. And I think it's probably the juxtaposition between extreme ability and, for want of a better word, extreme disability. And I think this is where there's similarities between my work on psychopaths. People often say, why are we so fascinated by psychopaths? And another group of people say, well, it's because they're so normal. And yet they're so different. Again, it's that kind of juxtaposition between normality and total abnormality, which I think is similar maybe with savants and extreme ability and extreme disability. But I mean, in going right the way back to the phone model of intelligence with which we started, fantastic. I mean, it sounds like an exam question. This define savants according to your model of phone intelligence.
Right. Okay, well, I'll put my hands up here to say savants were quite influential in coming up with the phone model, as we might call it now. My theory of the minimal cognitive architecture of intelligence and development. What I was arguing is, look, we need to be able to accommodate, in any serious theory of intelligence, we need to accommodate the phenomena that some people have remarkable abilities but very low measured IQ. Okay, and I think there are ways of doing it. You can take the quite opposite stance. Again, the polarization in this stuff is amazing. So somebody like Howard Gardner, who's a biologist, and probably no coincidence, came up with a very influential theory of intelligence, which was simply to say, look, there is no such general thing. It's all just different bits and pieces. And savants were examples of how, it revealed all the hidden talents, if you like, that are normally obscured.
Can I just clarify that, Mike? Can I just clarify just for the listeners what you're saying? So would it be fair to say that Howard Gardner's, I think it was his theory of multiple intelligences, wasn't it?
That's right.
So would it be fair to say that Gardner's kind of depiction of intelligence would be like a collection of talents, I suppose, like golf clubs in a bag, something like that? That's what intelligence was. Okay, right.
And
Sorry,
you might have more of this or less of that.
Sure.
Exactly.
Golf clubs in a bag and mobile phones. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Getting very sophisticated.
We've had a few other. We've had a few other analogies in there as well, haven't we? Eyes, ears. We've had them all.
Cats in a box. Yeah.
Cats in a
shitting in a box. That's a beauty.
Yeah.
But to me, using savants as kind of demonstrations of what intelligence is would be like, building a theory of thermodynamics based on the spontaneous combustion of individuals. These are weird phenomena, really, really weird. That's not to say they should be ignored. And personally, I haven't ignored them. And I'll give you a couple of examples where it can be accommodated. So in my system, if you have slow speed, if your phone isn't that good, it doesn't matter if the function is modular, right? So if it's something that evolution has given you. So there should be examples of people who, so if we want to say the function is potentially modular, like language, maybe like music, Bruce, it's possible that this can exist independently of any general level in your phone. You've just managed somehow for this to express itself. Normally it wouldn't. On the other hand, there was a guy, myself, Neil O'Connor and Beata Hermelin published a paper in the 90s on a young autistic chap who had never been able to speak his entire life. He couldn't communicate. But his father was a mathematician. And his father noticed one day that while he was sitting at his desk, and he could barely write, I mean, he had poor control over his pencil, but he was looking and he's thinking, hang on a minute, he's writing down the common factors of these numbers. This is amazing. And common factors are things like, 2 times 2 is 4, 4 times 4 is 16, and so on. So he could factorize numbers. And this drew our attention because if you can factorize numbers, in theory, you should be able to recognize a prime number. And prime numbers are very weird things. Like nobody knows how many primes they are. And there's famous cases in the literature of people who know that 3,544,123 is a prime. I have no idea whether it is or it isn't. But, they know bizarre
it is,
things.
Mike.
Anyway, cut a long story short, we went to test him to see how he was doing it, right? So he could indeed recognize whether a number was a prime number or not. And for your listeners, a prime number is simply a number that is only divisible by itself in 1 with no remainder. So we set up this experimental task and you had to press one button if it's prime and no button if it wasn't a prime. And we recorded how long it took him to do it. And we gave him this set of prime numbers all below 1,000, and we divvied them up into different kinds of primes, some that were easy because they were divisible, easy non-primes because they were divisible by 2 or 5 or 7. Others, you only knew that it wasn't a prime because it divided by 19. And, this is a guy who's never taught And he virtually got them all right. We then took this number set back, took him about 40 minutes sitting, pressing a button, prime, not prime, prime, not prime, and gave them to a bunch of engineering graduates who all wanted to bail out. They knew how to do it, but it was exhausting. And they wanted to bail out after about an hour and a half. And it took them on average about 3.5 hours to go through this collection of primes. And the way you do it is called the sieve of Eratosthenes, who discovered this in Greece. You divide a target number by any number, by any prime number up to the square root of that target. So we did another series of experiments measuring, well, how long does it take to divide this number by 3? How long does it take to divide this number by 7? And we wrote a computer simulation to generate how long would it take to do this with these primes. And it matched this guy's data beautifully. So as far as we can tell, not having been taught anything by anybody, he could sit there and divide these potential numbers by every prime number up to the square root of that number and then go, yes, it's prime, or, oh, no, it isn't, because it divides by 19.
Yeah.
How can he do this? Well, from my perspective of intelligence, he has to be thinking, right? He has to be thinking. So that should mean, in theory, he has fast speed of processing because he's thinking complicated thoughts that lots of people can't think. So we give him this little test, and I'm not saying it's the be-all and end-all, and I wouldn't stake my life on it, but lo and behold, he had fast speed of processing.
Right.
So this particular guy is an example of someone who, were it not for the brain damage that he incurred as a little boy, would have been super smart.
Right.
But that's not all it takes to manifest super smartness. You have to have other things. And those things were blown away by brain damage.
But reverse engineering that, it's interesting because, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are certain things that you might describe as modular skills. And you mentioned music as being one of them, right?
Yep.
And in when, unfortunately, the brain starts to deteriorate, in something like Alzheimer's, there's a disproportion. The skills don't all go away at the same time. There's a completely disproportionate, and some of the last things to go are music. So you get concert pianists who've got Alzheimer's, can't remember who came in the room 5 minutes ago, but they can still play brilliantly. You know, it's extraordinary.
Phenomenal.
Yeah.
It is phenomenal. And Neil O'Connor studied a boy, and you'll probably appreciate this more than most, Bruce, but I remember being blown away when I saw a video of it. It was a young boy. I won't mention his name, but he was about 13 years old, and he could play just about anything on the piano from hearing it once, right? He could hear this. And they were giving him stuff. They did things like give him Bach, like, Jesus, and it was fantastic because they had some students from the Royal College in London, and they had this Bach thing, 2 minutes worth of Bach, and if you can see the video, it's hilarious. The student would go, doo, and that was it, got the first note, and this guy would sit down, and not perfectly, but make a good fist of having heard it once, and they even got someone to write a novel piece of music, like just for this demonstration, and he could do that too. But the thing that blew me away was he played Let It Be with his right hand on the piano and his left hand on the fret of a guitar. Wow. So he accompanied himself playing, like Jimi Hendrix used to do on his, with his, well, it would be his right hand, but you know what I mean, his left hand on the fret and playing the tune simultaneously.
Wow.
But this guy had, and it used to be the hallmark of Savant syndrome that you had to have a low IQ because that's what made it stunning, because the ability. Somebody with I don't know if you've seen Daniel Tammet, he's got videos, his name's Daniel Tammet, he's got videos all over YouTube.
Right.
But he's got a normal IQ, but this guy, like, do you know what pi is? Can you tell me what pi is?
Oh God, it's the ratio of the ratio of the circumference of the circle to its whatever it is.
Radius.
Diameter.
Diameter.
Yeah.
There you go.
Diameter.
It's 3.17 and then a shed load of numbers.
3.14159 is all I can remember.
Yeah.
Right? This guy can recite pi to 22,000 places.
Jeez.
Without a mistake. And he did it in the Royal Society or something one afternoon. Took him 6 hours with people checking off the digit. But he can not only do that, he learnt Icelandic in a week.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
Good enough to be interviewed on a TV show in Icelandic. So it wasn't just learning a few words. But this is on the borders of being so extraordinary.
Right.
As I say, it's not going to be the guts of a theory of intelligence, but a theory of intelligence should be able to at least accommodate in principle how this can happen. I think mine can't, but there you are.
We haven't fallen out, Mike, which is pretty good going for a 2.5 hour chat on intelligence, mate.
Yeah.
But it's been absolutely wonderful. I think we're definitely going to get a double header out of this one, Bruce. What do you reckon?
I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, guys, and without wanting to be too fawning and nauseating, it's nice to speak to interesting people, and the questions were good, and the insights were interesting, frankly, and often better than I've got from some of my colleagues over 30 years, but there you are.
Well, I think it was Mark Twain again said, you need two things. You need ignorance and confidence. And Bruce and I have got both of those. I think in the top trumps ignorance and confidence, and we're both quite high. Mike, it's been absolutely fantastic. Let's keep in touch, obviously. And I think we've all learned a hell of a lot there.
No, it's fantastic. And I've got 2 people I can torment when I come down to Australia now.
You certainly have.
You have, Bruce. You have indeed.
You certainly have.
Thank you very much, guys. I enjoyed that.
Hello, folks. We hope you're enjoying Psycho Schizo Espresso. Just to remind you, it's a pod production, so please feel free to like, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcast. You can also reach out to us on email at pse@podprod.co.uk and follow us on social media on the hashtag Psycho Schizo Espresso. You can also, of course, become a Patreon by clicking on www.patreon.com/Psycho Schizo Espresso, where you can gain exclusive access to unedited and unfiltered content if your brain can possibly handle any more of me and Bruce.